Gunmaker Match founder Rob Pincus on the fallout of the CEO killer using a 3D printed pistol. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also a C9 contributor and the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free newsletter today if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America from a sober, serious perspective that focuses on hard news reporting and analysis. You can also, of course, buy a membership if you want to get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces that you will not find anywhere else. This week on the show, we are discussing the CEO killer's 3D printed handgun. It turns out that when he was caught, the suspect was caught, they recovered a firearm, and it appears the frame of that firearm was indeed 3D printed. To do that, we have somebody who's been on the show before a while back, but also has founded a shooting competition for people who make their own firearms. It's called the Gunmakers Match. And his name is Rob Pincus. Welcome back to the show, Rob. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, it's always good to chat with you about topics of concern of the moment, and also anything firearms related, especially the politics and the sort of social zeitgeist of guns and gun issues, because you do have your finger on the pulse. And I appreciate you inviting me in to talk about what is not the greatest thing I'd have to talk about, which is a very public, high profile killing.
Yes, absolutely. So, it's a terrible story, and I think it may have a significant impact in a number of ways on our politics, our gun politics moving forward. And, I think you're somebody who can speak to this. Obviously, I've got a couple pieces at the Reload where I talked to a number of different pioneers and enthusiasts and activists in the homemade gun space, 3D printing and everything. And there's a variety of viewpoints from a pretty eclectic group of people, frankly, some of them who are currently, suing one another, but they all have interesting insights into what happened here. But you are somebody who both is involved in running a traditional firearms manufacturer, right? But also have been heavily involved in the homemaking space, and you created the first shooting competition for people who like to build their own firearms. I went and covered the inaugural event down in Florida a couple of years ago. And you're on your fifth one, right?
Fifth annual will be in Western Pennsylvania, May 17th, that weekend.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll make it out to that.
That'd be great.
We'll see.
Yeah.
But, so just give people a little more about your background here, why you have your feet in both sides of this world, like in the traditional manufacturer side and the homemade gun space.
Yeah, sure. So both of those are evolving stories that have taken much more time out of my life and my professional interest over, I'd say, like the last 5 to 10 years. So I came into the industry since the 90s, primarily an educator, right? So I've been teaching people how to use guns, how to be responsible gun owners, armed professionals in the public sector. And obviously most of my work over the last 10, 15 years has been focused on the civilian, the homeowner that wants to stage a gun or carry a gun. Personal Defense Network, where I'm at the Personal Defense Network studio today, working on videos for that audience. About 10 years ago now, with some friends, we were sitting around at one of the trade shows, started pushing forward the idea, hey, we should start a gun company, right? Like, I've got this knowledge about how guns actually work and how people use guns and what kind of features would be important to gun owners, particularly people who are going to carry the gun for defense. Another guy at the table had some manufacturing background. Another guy at the table had the distribution and sales background. And it's kind of, maybe we could figure this out. And lots of stops and starts and a pandemic and a divorce or two along the way of that time period between all the guys involved. One of those guys is still involved with me to this day as a partner. And we brought in some other partners with more manufacturing expertise. And we did launch the Avidity Arms PD-10, a gun that I designed specifically for concealed carry. Coming up on just 2 years ago, in about a month, will be our first shipping and retail sales of the gun. So for a couple of years, I've been in the traditionally manufactured firearm business, right? We're actually shipping the gun, not just the design and the plans.
And you have to get the licensing from the federal government to do all that stuff. So you're familiar with the professional manufacturing side. You've gone through all the the steps to the regulatory steps that come along with that,
and continue to comply with all those, right? So it's we're a type 1 licensee, which means we can do the transfers. We're a type 7, which means we have the manufacturing license. We have a variant so that we can work with people outside of our building who are touching important parts of the gun. And the ATF knows that they are working on the gun, and we haven't actually transferred it to somebody else. If it gets, if it's in their building, it's still sort of under our responsibility. Yeah, we have an SOT, a special occupation tax we've paid to be able to deal with guns that would be under the NFA and things like suppressors, which I know we're going to be talking about. On the private gun making side, well, for about 15, 20 years, I've been more and more involved in the politics of guns and gun rights activism and dealing with making sure we don't get more of our rights taken away. And trying to regain some of our lost rights, like we've done, I would say most obviously in the concealed carry space, where we've gone from lots of states 30 years ago not allowing concealed carry to now the majority of states allowing permitless carry. So those two things started to overlap in the late 2000 teens when more and more people were doing private gun making with kits. This is kind of on the cusp. A lot of people will point at 2013 as like the birth of the 3D printed gun with the Liberator and a lot of mass media attention. But it really didn't go anywhere for about another 5 to 7 years before the home hobbyist 3D printing and the gun community really started overlapping because of capabilities and interest and things like that. So 3D printed guns.
Of course, people have been building their own firearms.
Oh, absolutely. 100%.
Forever,
yeah.
Right.
I mean, even growing up in New Jersey, guys would buy the black powder, build your own musket type kits, right? And it's mostly wood. I've actually just recently done one of those myself. It's mostly woodworking and a little bit of metal fitting, but it's still making your own gun. And in New Jersey, where muzzle loaders were controlled as in terms of you had to have a special purchase permit process to buy them. There was a period of time where you could buy the kits and build your own and not have to worry about going through the steps for a traditional way. So everywhere I've been in my life, there's always been at least a small portion of a subculture and mind space into privately making guns. I actually did do some 80% metal gun building in the 90s. I did some the first resin kits.
That was the fad, like the way that people would do it for, through the 90s, 2000s, up until 3D printed started to become a more mainstream option.
I think a real big mover
and stuff, right?
In the 2000 teens was the advent of the polymer kits. So once you had resin kits that you didn't need a lathe and a big drill press or even a home CNC machine or a CNC in a shop, or like a Bridgeport type machine. Once you did it, when you could do it with a drill and a file in your home with like, obviously Polymer 80 became the biggest company that does it. 80% Arms is probably the biggest company right now doing those polymer kits. Once it became easier, then it became really popular. And about all this sort of happened, the 3D printing started getting more popular. The kits started getting more widely distributed. And I think the gun control community figured out, you know what? Assault weapon bans were not getting anywhere. Magazine capacity bans were not getting anywhere. What are these ghost guns? Because it was a marketing term that we were using in the community. And it was really easy to flip a switch around 2018, 19 into 2020 and say ghost guns are bad. They're horrible. They're scary. They're the tools of the bad guys only. Why would you ever want a gun without a serial number? And it became a focus of the media and the gun controllers. And that's when I got really involved. That's when I started to sort of, I guess, like, let me take this under my wing because I think there's a big space here for even the gun industry and the would-be leaders of the gun industry organizations, the politics side, the Save Our Rights side, that they also kind of looked at it a little bit sideways, like kind of like bump stocks, are bump stocks that big a deal to have, Trump's going to get rid of bump stocks, but who really cares was kind of the attitude of a lot of people in the gun community. I think the same thing was potentially going to happen with 3D printed guns and ghost guns because it was such an exposure. It was so easy to attack in the media. And that led to me wanting to get more involved, wanting to work with Polymer 80, work with the guys at like Defense Distributed and now the Catalog and that whole 3D printing community. And one of the things I started hearing from the private gun makers was, we can't even take these to ranges and shoot. Like ranges won't let us use them. We have a hard time buying parts because so many of the gun companies don't want to support private gun making. They think they're losing money if we print our own frames or if we use these kits. And the reality is, as a manufacturer, I assure you that piece of plastic for the frame of the gun cost me very little. there's a lot of profit when you think of that as the gun. But the reality is all the other parts, like the barrel and the slide and the machining that goes into that and the engineering work that goes into the trigger system, that costs a lot more to get to market. I would love to just sell somebody a kit with all the metal parts for a fair price and let them 3D print the frame at home. So Avidity Arms, my company, was actually the first traditional licensed manufacturer to give the file to the 3D printing community for our frame. And in fact, it was optimized. It was optimized by a team of guys who are way more skilled at 3D printing and CAD than I am, led by a guy who goes by Mr. Snow online. Mr. Snow Makes. He helped us develop and led the team that developed an optimized version of our frame that fits all the parts we use in the traditionally manufactured gun, but is optimized for home hobbyists with the 3D printer. And then they can customize it.
You see other members of the industry going in that direction?
I haven't. I wish we would. I wish we did see that. You know, I was hoping to be able to have other companies say, look what we've done, and not necessarily say, look what we've done like Rob, but at least say, look what we've done. And, you know, I'd love to see a Ruger or Smith & Wesson, you know, whoever come out and do it. One of the indicators I have that I don't think that they will anytime soon is go back to companies like what Polymer 80 was doing, go back to what 80% Arms does. They're working with, what's known to us, what's known as the Gen 3 Glock design is sort of what it all goes around. Or an AR-15 design. And those are designs that are not protected by intellectual property law and patents and controls. So those are sort of like open source bases to work on. Right. What we did was we took the current frame. The day we started selling that gun in gun shops, we also released the frame, exact frame, using our current parts and our current specs to the 3D printing community. So, you know, you don't see Glock putting out here's the frame specs. We're not going to get mad if you make a Gen 5 Glock at home. Here, we're not seeing SIG say, here's the 320 specs. We're not going to get mad. Or, you know, the chassis, the firearms control unit. You know, there is a company out there that for a while was selling a do-it-yourself firearms control unit that required machining, required some drill press type work. But I haven't seen any of the major manufacturers embrace this idea of working with the private gun community. My position is
well, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, my position is I don't want them trying to reverse engineer it and getting it wrong. I want them to have a frame design that they can use as a base that will work great with our parts. And ultimately, they have to get the parts through, we use JSD Supply. They have to get the parts from JSD Supply, which does amazing work supporting the private gun making community. And we sell to them at the wholesale level.
And I guess that kind of dovetails perhaps with the main focus of what we're talking about, which is this shooter used the 3D printed gun, or at least the 3D printed frame. Obviously, this is something that I think a lot of people outside of the gun world don't really understand, or who don't have context within how these homemade guns are actually made. Only the frame is 3D printed. The rest of the gun is, as you were mentioning, factory made parts.
Traditionally manufactured parts that have to be purchased. And that's why when I get calls from like England, or I just talked to a reporter from France, like, do you think that the proliferation of 3D printed designs online could lead to more guns on the streets of Paris? Well, I mean, anything's possible, but in Paris, you can't just go to any of 50 stores like you could in St. Louis and buy the slide, the trigger kit, the springs, the magazine, the ammunition, the barrel. All of those things are incredibly hard to do at home yourself. And the whole 99.9% of the privately manufactured firearms in the US, whether they're kits or 3D printed, rely on a readily available supply of traditionally manufactured gun parts.
Right. But I would imagine that the high profile use of a 3D printed gun in this killing is probably the kind of thing that turns off Glock and Smith & Wesson and other major manufacturers.
Yeah, I'm not saying I don't get it. I'm just saying we were hoping that, and I do think there's been a positive move when we saw a lot of the big distributors start selling the gun kits. Some of the biggest names in the industry. It wasn't like you had to, go to a guy in a parking lot of a gun shop and buy a kit out of a van. I mean, they were being distributed when they started being distributed by Brownells would be the example. When they started being the people there's companies that nobody knows on the front because they're B2B, the big wholesaler distribution shops that sell to the retailers. When those kits started being distributed by those companies, they're the old guard, right? They're the people that really are the establishment in the industry. Even National Association of Sporting Goods Wholesalers, that represents the largest group of ammunition and firearms wholesale businesses, they were very involved with Polymer 80, let's say 6, 7, 8 years ago. They were major sponsors of their annual trade show. So the industry was starting to really embrace to some extent, let's say. And then 3D printing was the kits. The 3D printed was the outside. We're not sure about them. And things like the Gunmakers match started to change that conversation. Certainly something like this high profile event today could be a setback at the very superficial level, but ultimately it comes down to reminding people that, and now we just had data, you and I were talking, the first real research that's been done on privately manufactured firearms has now shown conclusively that the negative outcomes numbers with privately manufactured firearms are not only very low over like an 18-year period this study looked at, but also they're consistent with what happens with regular guns. So regular guns, 50 to 55 to 65% of the deaths every year with regular guns, they're suicides. Less than 3% of the deaths associated with regular guns every year are negligence or accident. And that leaves that other 40% there, give or take, every year that are actually the violent, homicide killings that we think of as being the bad part of guns. And that is the major bad part of guns. When you look at the numbers for privately manufactured firearms, according to this study using CDC numbers, National Violent Crime Database numbers, we see exactly the same trends. So again, guns are guns, and it's the people we need to be addressing.
But one thing I'm wondering about all this is you've mentioned it earlier too, is that study is not going to get anywhere near as much attention and publicity as this killing has. And this killing has probably this has got to be one of the most high profile killings in a long time, right? Especially the way that it was carried out by this attacker. I mean, he was trying to get a lot of attention on this. He left all sorts of messages and writing on the casings, and even the way he carried out the killing, like in the middle of New York City outside of a hotel with a silencer suppressor that seems more like a flare to try and draw attention than to try and reduce attention, even though that's what you might assume he was trying to do with the silencer. The backpack thing with the monopoly money, the manifesto, all this stuff. It feels like somebody who, like the Columbine killers, was very well versed in the media of his time, in the way that it's going to maximize how much exposure all this got. And the fact that he used a 3D printed gun and a silencer, I suppose, in the addition to that, adds to the already pre-existing notions around these devices. The impression that a lot of Americans have that, media, whether news or really more so Hollywood media, gives off, or video games, about both 3D printed guns and silencers being like these assassin weapons that are, ghost guns, right, as people call them. How do you see that playing out? I mean, I think you said for the piece that I interviewed you for, this is something that's going to be brought up anecdotally pretty much forever, right? Oh, for sure. Yeah. This, just like you mentioned Columbine, right? So Columbine is the school shooter version of a very high profile thing that really shook us as a culture and as a community. We're like, that was for a lot of people the first time we ever, even though there were other things that had happened at other schools, even that was the one that got everybody's attention, right? I think even though we've talked about, like I said, it's been over a decade, we've been talking about 3D printed guns and the potential danger they pose to society. But now it's got your people's attention. There's people who weren't talking about it, would never have talked about it, that now will be talking about that New York City killing. And somebody at that dinner party is going to say, oh yeah, he used a 3D printed gun. I guess. Yeah. And because that's a good point too about the Columbine kids, because they weren't the first ones to do that sort of thing. Right. And the same thing here. We've seen killers use 3D printed guns.
I would say the biggest difference is video. We had video of those kids dangling out of the window, dropping from the library at Columbine. We had video. We ended up seeing the surveillance video of them running, moving in through the cafeteria and shooting kids. We saw video of all the cops outside, like doing nothing, essentially just surrounding the place. Now we see video of this. So when this thing first dropped, right? And I've had a pretty busy, week, but obviously this got my attention, right? So when it first dropped, I was seeing a lot of stuff online. Wow, that guy really looks like a professional. He looks like this was planned and well planned and
looks like it's out of a movie, right?
But that's the thing. It's most people's idea of what a professional assassin looks like. Hey, thankfully,
exactly.
Right? Thankfully, most people's impression is from a movie. So I was just kind of like me being like the boring guy on the internet. I was just like, well, actually, and I had just been in Manhattan maybe 5 or 6 days before that. And I'm like, he would have had a hard time finding a place that was more densely populated with cameras and cops than like the 10 square blocks where he carried out this killing. Like if he'd have tried, right. He'd have been like at the White House, like outside of the White House or at an airport. Like other than that, I don't know where he could have been, that it would have been more likely that he would be seen and caught. Well, so it's kind of like refuting.
The gun also didn't function well. Like
I wasn't as worried about that, right? But it was kind of like, so what I was saying was, as far as this, he's a professional hitman. No. And then people were like, well, he cleared, then second tier, right? Well, he cleared those malfunctions really well. Well, A, that's kind of an indicator that he's not professional because he didn't put those things together. And B, right. He cleared those malfunctions. And I know you talked about this on CNN and you even, I was really proud of you, right? Like I was like, oh, good job, Stephen. Because you said something in there. The way I don't remember exactly how you said it. The way I was saying it to people was he cleared those things like a guy who was expecting it to be a problem, exactly. But not like he would have been trained if he was a professional military law enforcement, or if he'd been through one of my classes.
He didn't tap and rack.
Right. He was like smacking the back to put it back in the battery, but he wasn't surprised. He wasn't caught off guard. So that was a little bit odd. All that was kind of odd until the news came out that the deny, defend, delay, or whatever it was, all that the 3 words were on the cases. Once that piece of information came out, a lot of things started making sense to me. It's like, oh, he wanted to be seen. He wanted it to be in a high profile place. He was trying to send a message. And maybe if the guy's super sharp and quote unquote professional, he even had a gun that was set up specifically not to cycle like a normal semi-auto, because as you know, that case could have bounced off a wall and gone down a sewer. It could have been, those then you got to find those cases. Maybe he wanted to drop those cases right there. And then at one point it was like, maybe it's that B&T gun that's intended. And I never really, and I thought you clarified the slide motion and all that.
It couldn't be that gun.
But it really started to make sense to me that maybe that was on purpose. Well, now we're right. Then we sort of made another jump back when it came out that it was a 3D printed gun. Because it's like, well, if it was a 3D printed gun, then he probably didn't have a booster. If it was a homemade suppressor, he probably didn't have the Nielsen device booster that was designed to help make it reliable. So that explains why he had practiced with it. He knew he was going to have to go through those manual malfunction clearings, but not in a trained way. What made this all make sense to me, and you haven't mentioned this part of the piece of the puzzle yet. When it all really, and I should say, let me just clarify. I'm not saying it makes sense that this guy was killed, right? I'm not trying to, it's always hard to try to say, logically, here's what he did, when it's completely irrational and illogical to murder somebody in Manhattan, right? Over this issue. But what made it all sort of make sense to me, where, okay, now I'm not super confused, was the revelation about this guy's sort of hero worship of the Unabomber. Because his hero worship of the Unabomber, to me, says if he wanted to emulate the Unabomber, but not make bombs, not be a copycat, but emulate the style of it, well, he's going to have a manifesto. He's going to have an agenda. He's going to have like a reason he can say, this is why I did it, not just because I'm a crazy, angry guy in pain, but I'm trying to make the world better through my actions. I'm trying to take the fight to the people that are hurting us and our world. He wanted to have his own DIY technology kind of spin, right? So now that's why he's building his own gun. Because let's face it, against the narrative of those who would take away our right to privately manufacture firearms, this guy wasn't a prohibited person. He could have spent the money. He was running around with all kinds of cash, right? He could have bought a gun. He could have passed a background check. He didn't melt the gun down. You saw the Wired documentary I did on 3D printed guns at that first gun makers match. Remember the journalist that came and did that with us. He lived in California. We had to burn and melt his gun that he made for the match because he couldn't take it back to California. So this guy could have smashed it up. He could have thrown it in the East River. He wasn't trying to hide. He knew eventually he was going to get caught. He even said it in his manifesto that when you catch, this is why I did this. So I think the guy really is emulating a Unabomber approach, and probably he knew he was eventually going to get caught, but he probably would have tried to take out a few more healthcare, CEO, insurance related people as time went on. I just can't figure out why he's still carrying the gun, still carrying the fake ID, sitting in McDonald's eating a hash brown. And then I remember, oh, wait, something's off with this guy. I can't try to make sense of it completely.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, a lot of this is obviously speculation, but one thing we can take away is that you didn't need to make a 3D printed gun because he didn't have the criminal record that would require him to try and get around just buying a gun from a regular licensed dealer. The gun seemed to be a hindrance to him more than any sort of advantage because he was malfunctioning. The suppressor, the silencer, didn't see, he was shooting this guy right in front of other people. So it's not like he was trying to conceal the fact that he was murdering somebody. So this doesn't make a lot of sense. The whole setup that he had, it when you're ambushing somebody who's unarmed, you don't need everything to be to your advantage to accomplish your goal of killing them. So it didn't matter in the end, but obviously it's actually put him at a disadvantage. The setup that he was using. And so it's like, well, why go that path? And maybe it's the reasons that you suggested here. I think those are, logical, attempts to ferret out what he's doing. But we obviously can't know for sure. And just like we can't know the impact, but I do think that this level of attention on an act like this that so well reinforces a public perception about both 3D printed guns and silencers, even if that perception is not really accurate. Even if you look closely at this particular killing, it probably does cause a lot of political problems for, people who want to see 3D printed firearms become more accepted and don't want to see them banned.
I think it's atmospheric. Right. I want to be careful about political. I don't think that there all of a sudden is going to be especially with the incoming administration, I don't think all of a sudden there's going to be legislative action, formal politics. I think informally.
Not at the federal level, right?
Well, even at the state level, I think that informally, anecdotally in the media, and maybe even for if Everytown or Giffords or Brady or somebody, if they're giving a speech at some point or a presentation to a quad full of college kids, they'll probably say something about, we see the people who are using 3D printed guns. It's killers in the streets of Manhattan. But I think that's a throwaway line. It's like, we know who's using these weapons of war, people shooting up the schools, right? It's like when you really dig into the data, and actually that's why it's really ironic, but for me, convenient timing that a study that was just talked about at the National Research Conference for people interested in reducing negative outcomes with firearms. This study that was just put out there wouldn't get a lot of attention. But now, hopefully, people like you and me and other people, sort of educated in the real data there with the guns. When you come to me and say, "Hey, Rob, what do you think about this?" I can say, "Well, let's not forget this. The most recent study, the only real scholarly study that's been done, says very low presence of privately manufactured guns in these negative outcomes, and the trends, the percentages of how that breaks down." Is congruent with the trends of everything on normal guns. So as always, let's not worry about the type of gun or the features of the gun. Let's worry about the people that are using the guns poorly, and the people who are suffering from mental health issues or other extreme crises that lead them to want to take their own lives. And whether they choose a gun or a train, that's a problem in our society that we need to be talking about as well. A lot more than a 3D printed guy with back pain that felt like killing a CEO was going to make the world better.
Although obviously you know that in addition to those numbers from that study that look at the use of homemade firearms in deaths,
right?
Specifically, there is the ATF data that shows more and more what they call ghost guns. Now, you mentioned earlier that ghost guns, it's another one of these terms, like a lot of terms in the firearm world, that is not quite set in stone. It can mean a couple of different things. For it's a sort of euphemism, really. But ghost gun just means unserialized gun, and there's two different ways you could have. Well, there's really three different ways you could have an unserialized gun.
Yeah.
Which one? The more traditional way is that you file off the serial number that came on your factory-made gun. That's super common. 2 is the one that we're talking about now and that gets most attention, which is homemade firearms, which if you're just making them for personal use, there's no law that requires you, at the federal level at least, to put a serial number on your firearm.
Correct.
If it's for personal use. And then obviously the other one is guns made before 1960?
Yeah, and this one's a little tricky because lots of people will maybe go, well, I have my grandfather's lever action. Let me look. Wood has a serial number. Just
Some
like
of them will,
your TV has a serial number. Your TV doesn't have a serial number because the government tells you have to have one. It just does because businesses want to be able to track products. So there are serial numbers on a lot of older guns. The difference was those serial numbers aren't required to be on lists in a federal government database at the ATF.
Yeah.
So
you're not required to put them on there as a manufacturer.
Absolutely. And then a lot of that data is lost because gun companies go out of business and bad records in the 1800s.
I have a Sears roll mark ghost gun.
Exactly.
That I bought for the
and the problem is 5-10 years ago, I think this part's important to what you're saying. Local jurisdictions were when ghost guns first started to be talked about. And when people started asking, the media started asking, a lot of places, law enforcement jurisdictions were kind of putting all of these things. Any gun they couldn't trace was a ghost gun.
But the ATF has claimed that these recoveries are increasing over time.
They are, but here's the thing. You got to remember, if it doesn't say violent crime, take it with a grain of salt, because if you have a box of 10 ghost gun quote unquote kits in California and those get confiscated, that's 10 ghost guns involved in a crime. And it's kind of like a white collar gun crime, if you will. It's the crime of possessing something or making something when you weren't supposed to in New Jersey or
California
New York.
Some of these states require you to put a serial number on
Exactly. So there's a lot of loophole. If a gun gets stolen, it was involved in a crime. So there's a lot of loopholes for these numbers to be reported as way higher than they are. When we think of, it's kind of like mass shooter, right? We know what we mean when we talk about a mass killing, mass shooting event. We're talking about Columbine. We're talking about Las Vegas. We're talking about the Buffalo grocery store. We're not talking about a gang fight outside of a club at 2:30 in the morning where 3 or more people who did not know each other were killed. And that's how you get these. There are 400 mass shootings a year, as opposed to, we know, well, there were maybe 8 too many. And I don't like those gang fights either. But what I'm saying is the definitions matter.
Right. Yeah, certainly. And it is one of those things where it's important to be clear to people what you're talking about.
Yes.
But, certainly I would imagine that there are more homemade guns falling. The criminals do want to build guns without serial numbers if they can't go and buy regular ones. Now, of course, it is seems to be fairly simple for a criminal to buy a regular gun
or steal one, unfortunately, if guns aren't being stored well.
Or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's not, I don't know that this is becoming the preferred method for most criminals, especially because
it's a lot of work.
There's still some level of skill involved with, it may not be the hardest thing in the world to do anymore to make a gun at home, maybe easier than it was in the 90s, but it still requires some.
And there's still going to be a paper trail or an interaction trail, because you still have to go to Brownells and order the rest of the parts online, or you still have to go into your local gun store and be on that surveillance camera buying your local parts online. So you have to have a connection. I mean, we have enough trouble trying to establish good, responsible connections between people who have guns that don't feel comfortable going to gun shops just because they're not, maybe they don't look like you and I, and they don't think they're going to be welcome there. But now all of a sudden you're going to have the criminal that knows he's up to no good, that feels like, I'm just going to go buy a bunch of gun parts and a bunch of gun kits and make these guns at home. It's just not what we're seeing. The biggest danger, I think the biggest problem we have, and these people are caught and they are punished. It just happened very high profile way in California with someone who's been sort of a little bit of a hero to some people in the private gun making. We're very disappointed to see a conviction and a guy who's going to be spending a lot of time in jail because he as an insider was making guns, privately manufactured guns, and selling them to known criminals. And that is illegal, right? That's important to say for people that don't know. What you can make as many privately manufactured guns as you want, but you cannot sell them. You can't even transfer them to somebody else. Under the verbiage of the law. Now, what you can do under the new version of what is a frame or receiver,
without serializing it,
is take them to a class 1 federally licensed gun dealer. He can put a serial number on them and put them in his books and then transfer them as a traditional gun. But there hasn't really been a mechanism for that. So everybody if the criminal is buying a gun, buying a gun
Also,
that's stolen.
you can't knowingly sell a gun to.
Yeah, exactly.
somebody
It doesn't matter if it's a straw
prohibited
purchase, a stolen gun, or a privately manufactured gun. It still takes
Right.
somebody who's up to no good selling the gun to the criminal knowingly.
Right. Another argument that you'll hear from mainly from gun rights activists around this type of attack is, it's illegal to have a unserialized gun in New York. It's illegal to have a silencer of any kind in New York.
Right.
And none of those laws stopped this guy from doing exactly this. Obviously, it's also illegal to murder people in cold blood.
Right. Yeah, there are a couple of problems here, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of laws that he broke doing this, but the idea of 3D printing as sort of the end of gun control.
Mm-hmm.
You seem in some of the answers that you're giving here, like maybe you're a little skeptical of that concept, but what do you make of it?
I think that, as you said earlier, like people have been doing this for thousands of years, right? If you want to go back to, privately made cannons and muskets and things, right? Like in some way using gunpowder to throw something hard and fast at a castle or a person or a horse or a knight has been going on for a while, right? So definitely hundreds of years of private gun making here in the US. Now it's all of a sudden a problem. Was it a problem because it's easier? Is it a problem because of plastic? Or is it a problem because the suicide numbers are up and there's a lot of violence on the streets and there's too many people being killed by any means? You look at the numbers of like killings in Jamaica, killings in Brazil. Murder is bad. Violence is bad. But in some cultures, it's much more likely to be a knife than it is a gun. In our culture, I get it. It's the guns are used in murder more often. I don't think getting rid of guns gets rid of murder. I think that so as we see more and more privately made guns, what I'm really interested in is, are those guns proportionately showing up more often in crime than a traditionally made gun? Then we need to figure out what's going on. But until we see that, which we're not really seeing, then the hundreds of millions of guns that are out there in civilian hands, are some of them being used badly? Absolutely. Is there something more we can do in the gun community and the gun industry? Absolutely. I'm not one to pound on the table with the idea that bad guys are going to do whatever they want. There's nothing we can do about it because, for example, we can secure our guns in safes and not put, stickers on the side of our vehicle with a gun just tucked under the seat that make it really obvious that we are probably the kind of person that has a gun and it might be unsecured. So if a bad guy can break a window, reach under a car seat and pull out a gun, we should be doing a better job. But I don't care if it's an assault weapon, quote unquote, a ghost gun, quote unquote, high capacity mag, quote unquote. It's just the idea that we as gun owners can do something to stem the evil that's going to happen anyway. We can be responsible in the way we approach that.
Yeah, but some people view the evolution of 3D printed gun parts as evidence that, all these sort of regulations we put on firearms are ultimately pointless.
Well, sure. The pistol brace,
true or not?
The pistol brace, the fin grip, the bullet button. I mean, there's so many things that we have developed in the gun industry. I'll put my traditional manufacturer hat back on. There's so many things that the gun industry have developed. We ship ARs, semi-automatic ARs that are 12.5-inch barrel, have a foregrip, have a brace instead of a stock to New Jersey. And I was just back in New Jersey. I'm from New Jersey. I was back there visiting my mom and friends during Thanksgiving, and people couldn't believe that my company we were talking about it just kind of anecdotal. Are you selling a lot of guns in Jersey? Well, actually selling a lot of these firearms that fall into a category narrowly defined by the state of New Jersey as other, and anywhere else it would be an AR pistol. And AR pistols aren't supposed to have a foregrip, but in New Jersey, this other has to have one. Anyway, if you put all the Lego pieces together correctly, there's a great way to buy a legal, perfect home defense compact rifle in New Jersey. You could make it a pistol caliber too. And that's something that would never have been thought of or necessary. That configuration of gun would never be sold if it weren't for gun regulations that are specifically aimed at guns that look dangerous in New Jersey, featured certain combination of features. So I absolutely agree with the sentiment that, if there's a desire, if there's a will, there's a way kind of thing. And, but I hate the idea that we're skirting the law. The only reason somebody might be able to make the argument that we're working around the law is because the law is ridiculous. If a gun that looks this way, but performs exactly the same as one that looks this other way, this one's illegal because it looks scary when a politician holds it up, that's a law worth skirting. It's just silly.
Sure. But, and at the end of the day, you don't think the advent of 3D printing means that we should or will get rid of our.
Well, I know, because I don't think anybody who's pro gun control law is going to accept that argument. So sitting around the table, you and I and 6 other gun guys can roll our eyes and say, why would they even bother? We're just going to have to work around it. And I could see them on the other side saying, well, that's less time and less money going into more guns on the street, because you have to figure out how to get guns on the street in the first place because we passed another law. We just kicked the can down the road. So I understand the argument. I do agree with the premise of the argument. I just don't think it's an argument that's going to compel anybody to stop passing gun laws that wants to pass gun laws.
Okay. And so at the bottom of all this, I guess, what we saw in New York and the high profile nature of this killing with this firearm means we're likely to see this brought up
absolutely
for
forever.
Decades to come. But you're not as sure that it will actually lead to any real change in the law, one direction or the other, really. No,
I think it'll be a talking point, but it'll, again, I'll go back to Columbine. Columbine's been a talking point, and we haven't seen assault weapons. It was the assault weapons ban. Ironically, the Columbine event took place during the most restrictive time of guns in our country under the federal assault weapons ban. So no, I don't think, so that talking point, Sandy Hook, right? It gets brought up. I thought after, you hear gun controllers all the time. I would have thought after Sandy Hook, we could have done something in this country. Well, you couldn't, right? So I just don't, this is not one, especially when you have so many people on the left and the right that sort of get why this guy might have been targeted. I mean, it's not like you had some kind of high profile, you know what this is? It's what was his name? Larry Flint. There weren't a lot of people crying when Larry Flint got paralyzed, the founder of Hustler magazine. When he was shot and put in a wheelchair, there weren't a lot of people like, oh, but he was such an upstanding pillar of the community and such a great guy. Why would anybody ever want to shoot him? Right. And I think this guy is he may not be a porn king, seen as a misogynist predator against women at risk and vulnerable women. But this guy definitely is seen as somebody who had really horrible business practices and represents an industry that a lot of people are angry with in this country. So I don't know how, it's not a school shooting. It's not a domestic violence abuse. It's not a pedophile. But this guy is not a hero to a lot of people. So I don't know how far it's going to go in really tugging at the heartstrings. It'll be talked about. It'll be referenced, but it'll be referenced like the Hollywood shootout. Those guys that had converted fully automatic guns and were wearing body armor. That gets brought up a lot. We don't have a lot of body armor laws in this country, and we don't have an assault weapons ban federally in this country, even though those things get talked about and they kind of stick in the mind as a meme, a characterization that'll be talked about forever. But I don't think it'll have a major impact. Interesting.
All right. Well, look, we appreciate you coming on the show to give your point of view on all this and share some of your expertise from being involved in the 3D printing community for quite a while now. Actually, it's been, like you said,
been a minute,
quite a few years at this point. If people want to follow the work that you do, where can they do that?
Gunmakersmatch.com is the best place to land, to get links and resources to some of the people and the companies involved in the private gun making space. You can follow me, Pincus Rob, is usually what I go by at Facebook or, X, Instagram. I put a lot of stuff out. avidityarms.com. And really from a holistic, 100,000 foot view, any opinion, if this was interesting, you want to see what I think about waiting periods or background checks, go to 2AO.org, Second Amendment organization. I'm the executive vice president, and all of our policy statements are influenced by all the board, but I'm the one that has the final edit on those.
All right. Wonderful. Well, thanks again for joining us. That's all we've got for this week. If you want to get the podcast a day early or appear on the show in a member segment, make sure you check out our membership options over at thereload.com today. And we will see you guys again real soon.